In this video, I'll show you how to shade faces with pen and ink using hatching and crosshatching. In the earlier parts of this series, I showed you how to make value scales, shade flat surfaces, shade curved surfaces, and I showed you how perspective can help you to think about the direction of your hatching lines when you're shading simple geometric forms. You'll probably be happy to hear that, at least in my view, perspective and line direction don't matter as much when you're shading faces, but they do still matter, and I think you'll be glad that you learned how to shade simple geometric forms when you're shading faces. Faces are hard to draw, but this video is not about how to draw faces in terms of construction and proportion and so on. This video is about how to shade faces. If you can trace a drawing of a face, then that's good enough for this video, because I'll be working with a tracing of a drawing from this book, Drawing the Head and the Hands by Andrew Loomis. If you don't already know about the Loomis method for drawing the head, then you should really check out this book. I'll put a link in the description of this video. I think tracing is actually an overlooked skill that's good to practice, not because you should trace things instead of learning how to draw them, but because tracing can be useful for transferring your messy sketches onto clean paper before inking or painting, and also because tracing is a good way to practice your pencil control. So I'm tracing this drawing not only because it's a quick and easy way of drawing a head for shading practice, but also because it's something that should be easy for you to duplicate if you want to follow along with this tutorial. Faces come in different shapes and sizes, and I can't possibly show you how to shade all faces in all lighting conditions. So I was trying to think about how to generalize, how to give you some general ways of thinking about shading faces that you can later use to shade whatever specific faces you're working on. And that's why I thought we should focus on this drawing of the planes of the head. This is not a realistic head, but it can help you to think about shading the head, not as a set of overwhelmingly complicated curved surfaces, but as a set of simpler flat surfaces. That doesn't mean that your drawing won't look realistic, and later in this video I'll show you how we can use this drawing as the basis for a more realistic face. And I should say that this drawing is not the only way to think about the planes of the head. For example, there's also the well-known Asaro head, which was named after John Asaro, who sculpted it, and you can get physical sculptures and digital models to help you think about the planes of the head. The important thing here is not that we need to memorize one specific model of the planes of the head, but that we can learn to shade by simplifying complicated subjects such as the head into simple geometric forms such as flat surfaces, because we already know how to shade those simple forms. This 3D model was based on Loomis's planes of the head drawing, and you can download it and use it for free thanks to Shade Foundations, who published it on fab.com with a Creative Commons license, and I'll put a link in the description. I'm viewing this file in Blender, which is free and open source software for 3D modeling. I'm not a Blender guru, and you don't need to be either. This isn't a Blender tutorial, but I'll say that all I really did here is I imported the model, deleted the default light, added a sun, and changed the viewport shading to rendered. And now I can play with the angle of the sunlight to see how it falls on the planes of the head. I think 3D models are really useful tools for learning how to shade, but you could also make a physical model out of clay or something if you'd prefer not to work digitally, or you could look for photo references. For this tutorial, I'll set the angle of the sun to 30 degrees on the x-axis in Blender. Some of these planes are not actually flat. For example, you can see that the side of the jaw seems to have a gradient. It's darker towards the ear, where it's angled downwards, and it's lighter towards the chin, where it's angled upwards. I don't know if that's because of the way that Loomis drew the chin, it's wider at the bottom and narrower at the top, or if it's because of the way that this model was made, but I want this model to be as simple as possible for shading practice. I want to think about each of these planes as being just one value, so I'll ignore those gradients. The light is coming from straight in front of the head, and the sun is high above the horizon, so the nose is casting a shadow straight downwards, and that shadow has a hard edge. The brow ridge is also casting a shadow on the cheek, so I just roughly sketched in those shadow shapes in pencil. This is sometimes called shadow mapping. I think the underside of the nose is probably the darkest value on this face, and the eye sockets are also really dark. They're not pure black in the 3D model, but this is where you get to make your own artistic choices, and I wanted them to be black because I wanted there to be more contrast in the drawing. And for that same reason, I wanted the upward-facing planes on the top of the head, the top of the ear, and the front of the nose to be white. I wanted the front-facing planes on the cheeks and the forehead to be light gray, so I used something like value 2 from the value scales that I showed you in part 1 of this series. I used something like value 3 for the downward-facing planes on the chin and between the eyes, and I also used this value for the sides of the nose and the temples and the planes just above the temples, which are somewhere in between side-facing and upward-facing. I used something like value 4 or value 5 for the cast shadows, the sides of the jaw, and the other side-facing plane. In the 3D model, these planes have very similar values to the planes that I made black, but I wanted them to be distinct from one another in the drawing. You could absolutely make different choices about which values to use for which planes, but I hope you can see how it's relatively easy to go from the planes of the head to a shaded head, even though it's still quite angular and robotic. And I hope you can see that there are subsets of planes that have the same value, such as the side of the nose and the side of the head, because they're facing in the same direction. I think it's important to look for planes that are facing in the same direction and try to shade them with the same value. I used horizontal lines for the front-facing planes and vertical or diagonal lines for the side-facing planes, but you should play around with different angles to see what you like. There's not a right way and a wrong way, but different angles do have different visual effects. And of course, you don't have to use straight lines. In cross-hatching in pen and ink, August Lamb suggested that you could think about your first layer of hatching as a wreath that circles around the face. I think this example does a good job of bridging the gap between simple geometric forms and more complicated organic forms. Faces are not spheres, but they are spherical in places. These hatching lines circle around the face almost as if it were a sphere, and I hope this reminds you of the spheres that I showed you in part 3 of this series. And if we go back to the straight lines that I used in this drawing, I hope you can see that these hatching lines also kind of circle around the face, even though they're straight lines, because of the line directions that I used. Horizontal lines on the front-facing planes and vertical or diagonal lines on the side-facing planes. I guess this is less like a circle and more like a hexagon, but I hope you can see what I mean about circling around the face. You can sometimes suggest that something is rounded even though you're hatching it with straight lines. Loomis thought that too much roundness could make a drawing look boring, and that some combination of roundness and squareness could make a drawing look more vigorous. So the planes of the head are not necessarily just for shading practice. Here's an example of a more realistic drawing from The Gibson Girl Enter America by Charles Dana Gibson, which uses straight or slightly curved hatching lines in separate patches that remind me of the planes of the head, but they change direction suddenly around the temple, for example, and so they still seem to circle around the face and create a sense of roundness. Charles Dana Gibson was really a master of pen and ink portraiture, and this is a good book to study. These drawings are over 100 years old, but I think this is still some of the best pen and ink portraiture to study today. The hatching is somehow free and loose and yet tightly controlled at the same time. Even if you want to finish with a more realistic and rounded drawing, you can still start with the same planes of the head, but you can use curved hatching lines to round off the angular edges of the planes. For this drawing, I tried to make the same choices as I did before about which values to use for which planes, but I used curved hatching. I started with pencil guidelines to plan the curvature of the hatching. Sometimes the curvature is only subtle, but a little bit of curvature can go a long way towards turning the form, which is what people sometimes say when they're talking about making a drawing look rounded and three-dimensional. It can be hard to decide how to handle the intersections between different sets of hatching lines that are going in different directions, and cross-hatching can help to smooth the transitions, but I limited myself to hatching here instead of cross-hatching so that you can easily see how this drawing relates to the drawing with the straight hatching. You can also think about how hard or soft you want to make the edges of the planes and the transitions between values. For example, I made mostly hard edges around the eye sockets, but I softened them a little bit towards the cheeks, and I made hard edges on the bottom of the nose and the bridge of the nose, but I made softer transitions between the other planes. And that can also help to make your drawing look more realistic, to have a mixture of hard and soft edges. I think this drawing already looks less angular and robotic, even though it doesn't have eyes or a mouth, and even though it was based on a very simple model of the head. But it does look a little bit creepy. If you want to add the eyes and a mouth, you can use the same method as I did to shade the face. You can simplify your subject into a set of planes, map the shadows, choose a value for each plane or shadow shape, and then think about how you want to transition between those values, with either hard edges or soft edges and straight lines or curved lines. Loomis also drew the planes of the mouth in this slightly more detailed drawing of the planes of the head, so that could be a good place to start. But I think this is a good enough place to finish this example, since I think it's still abstract enough to be generalizable. And of course, this is just one example. There are many other styles you could use. I'll use the rest of this video to show you some other styles from comic book history, because I think you might be surprised by how simple it can be to shade a face, and yet how good it can look. When I was looking for examples, I was surprised at how few close-ups I found. Faces in comics are often relatively small, and even a very simple model of the planes of the head could be more complicated than you need. This book has some great examples of pure black and white pen and ink artwork, and thankfully it's still in print, or at least it was at the time that I recorded this video. The stories in this book are short, and it's hard to give examples without giving anything away, so spoiler alert, look away now if you don't want to see some great artwork. I wish there were more books like this that were still in print, but this is a great book if you're looking for some inspiration from a bygone era, and I'll put a link in the description. These drawings are not quite as old as Charles Dana Gibson's, but they're getting there. Some of the artwork in this book uses ink washes instead of pure black and white, or uses halftone screens. But what I really love to see is pure black and white line art. Some of this could be brush and ink instead of pen and ink. It can be hard to tell, but it's still a good example of what you can do with pure black and white. This example is by Reed Crandall, and if you look at the person on the left, I hope it reminds you of the lighting I showed you on the planes of the head. The side-facing planes all have the same value as one another, except that there's another light coming from the left, and so the leftmost planes are brighter. It's more complicated to shade when you have two light sources, but you can keep it simple if you want. The planes under the brow, under the nose, and under the mouth also all have the same value as one another. They're black. In this example, the side of the nose is not the same value as the other side-facing planes, but it often is in other examples, such as this one, also by Reed Crandall. If you look at the person in the middle, the cast shadow under the nose is confusing, but I think there's otherwise some really good hatching and cross-hatching here, especially the figure on the right. I love this style. And you'll see that the cross-hatching is slightly curved, and that helps to turn the form, kind of like shading a sphere, but you'll also see that there are some straight lines in the brighter areas on the side of the jaw, and I think that they help to project the face forward, kind of like shading the side of a cube. So there's some roundness and some squareness, as Loomis might have called it, and I think it works well together here. These examples have hatching or cross-hatching on less than half of the face, but that's actually a lot of shading for a comic. There's much less shading than that in a lot of comics. This example from the same book is by Wally Wood, and the only shading on these three faces is a little bit of hatching under the cheekbones, and just a couple of hatching lines on the sides of the noses, and I think that works well too. If you look at the person on the left, the outline is much thicker under the downward-facing planes of the chin and the mouth, and you could argue that those thicker lines are also part of the shading, but there's still not that much shading here. But here, there's a lot of shading, and I think it just looks magical. This is Reed Crandall again. It kind of sparkles because of all the micro contrast, which you just don't get with ink washes. For me, this is one of the main reasons for learning how to shade with pure pen and ink. And speaking of a lot of shading, this example is by Bernie Wrightson from his illustrated edition of Frankenstein, which is still in print. I think this shows how you can use relatively straight lines, which are not really cross-contour lines and which don't circle around the face, and yet you can still create the impression of a three-dimensional surface by making the hatching lines thicker in darker areas. You can see a simpler version of this same effect in this example, in which Wrightson used straight lines for the side of the face, but made the lines darker towards the front edge of the core shadow. You'll often see this, where the core shadow is darker near the edge of the shadow, which is sometimes called the shadow terminator. Farther away from the terminator, there's more reflected light, and so the core shadow is lighter. Some artists really like to emphasize that darker area. Wrightson also did that here, for example, or maybe he's just emphasizing the shape of the cheekbone, but he used a different style of hatching here, with a combination of straight and curved hatching in different directions. And here's an even more stylized example. These examples are from the book Creepy Presents Bernie Wrightson, which was out of print, but it's getting a new paperback edition soon. And here's another example by Charles Dana Gibson, in which the shadow is darkest near the terminator. You can see that clearly on the bridge of the nose and around the eye socket, for example. I hope you can see that anyway. Many of these examples are actually really small on the printed page. And if you want to see some really stylized examples of shading, you should check out Black Hole by Charles Burns. Burns uses thin to thick lines to transition between pure black shadows and pure white highlights. When I first saw this, I thought that it must have been done digitally because the lines are so perfect, but apparently it wasn't, which is really impressive. It's a really interesting style. In this series, I wanted to show you how you could go from simple value scales and simple geometric forms to something more realistic, and I thought faces would be a good example of how to shade, but I hope you can see how you could use these same methods not just for faces, but for anything really. Simplify your subject into a set of planes or other simple geometric forms that you know how to shade, such as cylinders and spheres. Map the shadows, choose a value for each plane or shadow shape, and then think about how you want to transition between those values with either hard edges or soft edges and straight lines or curved lines. I know that's easier said than done, and it takes a lot of practice, but please let me know if you have any other questions about shading with pen and ink. I had planned for this to be the final episode of this series, but maybe I can make a bonus episode. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more videos about pen and ink. Thanks for watching!